Now before I start off, I just want to say consoles are still the best way to play video games. It's just something about putting in a disc and starting to play. There's nothing as simple as that. Although there are patches on consoles these days. I would still rather play a game on a console than on a PC. But with that being said, this console generation is slightly weaker. If you don't believe me, just look at the comparisons between the PS2 and the PS3, and the PS3 and the PS4. It's so weak, in fact, that there's mid-generation console upgrades. This has never been done before. Although you could argue that the 32X was kind of a mid-generation console upgrade. I don't know. Let's not talk about the 32X. But back to the point. Mid-range cards like the GTX 650 Ti were already out at that point and were faster than the Xbox One in pure numbers. That is, the Xbox One was 1.3 teraflops while the GTX 650 Ti was about 1.5 teraflops. Although the PS4 was a little more powerful than that, there were a few high-end cards that would beat the PS4. Keep console optimization in mind. But even with that being said, this wasn't the case for the past few console generations. I think what happened is that the 7th generation overstayed its welcome, so most people just switched over to PC because those consoles, they just couldn't handle the new games. And with the 8th generation, although faster and bringing in a lot of new cool features, not being that big of a leap as past console generations, gave the PC market a chance to provide better graphics for a higher cost. But with PCs, you can make so many different combinations with the parts, you can't really have the optimization that consoles have. So, consoles are still the best bang for your buck. But they're not the same big bang for your buck as the past console generations. And here's why. Until the 8th generation, consoles were always sold at a loss, starting with the PS1. This was really bizarre when Sony introduced this, but it worked out. The PlayStation 1 sold 102 million units worldwide. So they did the same thing with the PS2. The PS2 cost about $488 to make, but they sold it at around $299. But guess what? It worked out even better, with the PlayStation 2 selling 155 million units, and it's still the world's best-selling console of all time. And then came the PS3. The PS3 continued this trend, selling at $600, but actually it cost about $802 to make. It didn't work out. In retrospect, it might seem like the PS3 did well. It was a disaster when it launched. Why, you might ask? Well, even though the PS3 cost $800 to make, but it sold at $600 was a little too steep for a console. On top of that, the PS3 had this really weird cell processor with really weird architecture, and this was done on purpose to make it hard for developers to develop for. Now, why in the hell would Sony do that? Now, here's their logic, and I'm not even joking. Their logic was, if you make it hard for developers to develop games for the PS3, developers would spend more time developing for the PS3 and forget about the other consoles. But guess what? The exact opposite happened, with the developers favoring Xbox 360 over the PS3, and the PS3 had no games. You see, the reason why these companies can afford to sell these consoles at a loss is they make all their money back from the games. But since the PS3 had no games, Sony couldn't make any money. The PS3's initial failure may be one of the reasons why Sony abandoned this business model. But one of the big reasons why Sony abandoned this idea is that Sony isn't doing well as a company. PlayStation is doing well, Sony's not. In fact, on every PS4 you buy, Sony makes $20. Maybe if the PS3 did well, they could have kept this strategy and underpriced the PS4, making it more powerful. But since they can't afford to do that, they make money on each PS4 you buy. Now, Nintendo never makes the most powerful hardware. When they do it, it's mostly because they had more time and the technology had caught up, like the Nintendo 64. And even though it didn't quite work out for them in the 8th generation, Nintendo was never in direct competition with Sony and Microsoft. They always target different gamers. The real question is, why was the Xbox One weak? Well, when developing, they probably had no clue other than the fact that Sony's next console would make profit, because Sony couldn't afford to follow their old business model. And also, Sony struck a deal with Samsung to get 8 gigabytes of RAM at the last minute, even surprising developers. The point being that all they could do is make a console close to the power of the PS4, but still, they can't be accurate. And it just turned out that the PS4 was more powerful than the Xbox. Here's a theory, and just a theory by the way. Microsoft decided to bundle a Kinect with every Xbox One, which may have resulted in the GPU taking a hit. Now you might be asking, why did Microsoft make a console that would completely blow the PS4 out of the competition, claiming the title of this generation? After all, Microsoft is doing well as a company. They're doing way better than Sony. But it would be a gamble, like the PS3 was. Hear me out. If I know the competition isn't making the most powerful console, why should I make a console that would completely blow it out of the water, but spend millions and also risk millions? See, consoles are sold in millions. Each console sold at about $100 loss would mean millions of dollars in loss, and if the console failed, well, they would lose millions, and their strategy of earning that money back from the games would fall flat on its face. I can see why the Xbox One chose not to do that. After all, the most powerful gaming console doesn't mean it would be the best-selling one. In fact, that has never been the case until this generation. Well, thank you guys for watching. Like it if you like it, dislike it if you disliked it. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this matter. If you want to know more stuff about gaming, like 10 bizarre facts about gaming you probably didn't know, be sure to check out my previous video. If you want to watch more gameplay videos, you can check out my cousin's gaming channel over here, and subscribe.